Good morning, everybody. I don't know exactly where this video is going to end up, but I decided I'd give it a quick run after thinking about a few things this morning. So, I think as everybody knows who's been following my conversation on this for the past 2 months at least, I do think that we have justification for using vitamin A in patients with acute viral infections, acute pneumonia, and obviously now with the 2019 2020 acute new coronavirus infection. So, briefly, I'll review some of that information here. We're all aware that vitamin A has a long history of use, and what that shows us is how to use vitamin A safely and how to predict any potential adverse effects, which we usually don't see. Uh, when we use vitamin A skillfully, we see that it has documented safety in various age groups. It's affordable and widely available internationally, and it has efficacy against a wide range of viral infections and bacterial infections, respiratory tract infections, gastrointestinal infections, etc. Because vitamin A is obviously not an antibiotic, it doesn't function by targeting any specific microbe. It functions by preserving and, in many cases, restoring immune function. So, we're all aware that many people are deficient in vitamin A and they live their lives relatively normally. They may be more likely to get certain cancers, they may be more likely to get autoimmune diseases, they may be more likely to get certain infections, but they are within the so-called norm, even though they might suffer more than they would if they were nutritionally depleted. So, what we should therefore expect is that patients who are nutrient deficient, in this case I'm just talking about vitamin A, uh, because I have to talk about vitamin A to talk about vitamin A, but the fact is all of these nutrients of course function together. People who have one nutritional deficiency typically have others. So if we say a given population has vitamin A deficiency, well, they probably have zinc deficiency, iron deficiency, a lot of times vitamin D deficiency, a lot of times selenium deficiency, and a lot of times they have protein deficiency as well. So, the idea of isolated nutrient deficiencies is really just a fabrication that we can create in laboratory experiments, but in the real world, nutrient deficiencies never happen in isolation. So, a certain part of the population is certainly deficient in vitamin A. I acknowledge that they are also deficient in other things. But as these people live their relatively normal lives with certain predispositions, one of the things they're going to be predisposed toward is whatever is the most recent infection. And of course, this new coronavirus gives us a chance to unmask those nutritional deficiencies by challenging their immune system with a new infectious agent. And I think that's what we're seeing. So, uh, part of what we see in these pandemics is the unmasking of previously hidden vulnerabilities, a major one of which are these nutritional deficiencies that I've been discussing. So, again, we see effectiveness of vitamin A against a wide range of bacterial and viral infections, respiratory, gastrointestinal, etc., because vitamin A doesn't target any particular infection. It helps immune barriers, it helps immune response, it helps promote tolerance, etc. So we see many benefits from vitamin A that certainly justify its use. Vitamin A and vitamin D work together at the same receptor. Both of these nutrients obviously have multiple functions. In the case of vitamin A has many different receptors. One of those receptors is a vitamin A, vitamin D, what's called a heterodimer, which means it has two components, one docking location or receptor for vitamin A and the other one for vitamin D. Many other receptors for vitamin A exist independent from its co-reception with vitamin D. So you'll never see so many benefits, with a drug or vaccine as you will with vitamin A. Vitamin A is endorsed. It has been endorsed for decades. In this case, we were looking previously here at the Journal Pediatrics from the American Academy of Pediatrics. They recommend using it for patients with measles they should have extended that to all types of infections. Again, here a document that I reviewed previously in an earlier video made in March. We're now in April, talking about vitamin A being essential for multiple functions, including uh, epithelial cells, which line the gastrointestinal tract, and the mouth and the nose and the pharynx, which is the throat, and also the lungs, etc. Subclinical deficiency, which is what I just talked about, results in increased susceptibility to common infectious diseases. They could have also said uncommon infectious diseases. So in this case, the world population, let's say, is being challenged with a new agent, and many people are not passing that exam. And I'm not making light of their situation, I'm just describing it. Subclinical nutritional deficiencies become apparent when people are stressed by exercise, by emotional stress, by sleep deprivation, by food challenge, whatever. This is a stress test for the human organism, and many people are showing that they're incapable of mounting a proper defense. We all know that vitamin A is used and recommended by the World Health Organization, especially when it's given at the time of vaccines. So a lot of the so-called fame and effectiveness that's attributed to vaccines is actually due to vitamin A supplementation. They give, in these vaccine programs, a lot of times to make the vaccines work better, they give nutrients, most commonly vitamin A, sometimes zinc, sometimes iron, sometimes protein, sometimes plumbing, sometimes education, sometimes economic programs as well. But they call it a vaccination program. They give these kids vitamin A, and then these kids get better, and then they give all the credit to the vaccines. So that plays out commonly with vitamin A. It also played out last year with vitamin D in two articles, or I shouldn't call them articles, in two replies that I published with the British Medical Journal's website. So you can take a look at those. I'm kind of in the process of responding to this announcement, and I guess they published a position paper, a statement from the Dietitians of Canada, which was strategically, it was actually a good piece in a certain sense for maintaining control of the narrative, for kind of deflecting liability. It was okay in terms of its achieving its goal, which is to make people inefficacious in preventing this disease. So they advise, following the advice of public health officials, those would be the same officials that actually helped, set the stage for this perfect storm. I think that they are spreading misinformation. I'm not real fond of this document, as you can tell by the words that I use. They're confused, either accidentally or intentionally. So I'll address that later. Here's what I've worked on all morning. I guess maybe even somewhat to my surprise, this is the first thing I did this morning, and you're about to take a look at it. So I've been working on this now for 6 hours. This pretty much just this one diagram, actually. So, in discussing and thinking about vitamin A as it relates to the coronavirus, here's what I've come up with, and I'm pretty pleased with this. I've been working on this for days. I'll show you the document in just a moment. I'll probably make that document available as a downloadable PDF, as an extension of my book Antiviral Nutrition, as an extension of Inflammation Mastery 4th edition, etc. So eventually this will be a document that's available. It's just not ready right now. It could be ready this weekend. So here's where I am with my understanding of vitamin A and how it could relate to this coronavirus infection that a lot of people have. So like I said before, a lot of people are vitamin A deficient. They live their lives relatively normally until they're challenged by something: stress, a hiking trip where they drink contaminated water and then they get a gastrointestinal infection. They're on an airplane with somebody who's got the flu or a coronavirus. Coronavirus accounts for about 15 to 30% of common colds, so it's actually a pretty common virus. Now, of course, we're dealing with a different mutation of that same virus, but it is still the same virus. That's why it's called coronavirus. So, my model here is that a lot of people have marginal vitamin A deficiency and then they are put into a challenge or a crisis. The crisis or challenge could be emotional distress, and that depletes them of vitamin A. Now they're vitamin A depleted, now they're immune suppressed, now they encounter any virus, and now they're sick. And then things only get worse. So what I'm really interested in lately is how the kidneys actually start to lose vitamin A during an acute infection. So that happens for two different reasons. One is interleukin 6, when that's released in response to infection or inflammation, that reduces hepatic protein production, especially albumin, which is what we see. That's what we see when we look at lab tests. But we can actually measure something that comes before albumin, and that's prealbumin. Well, the other name for prealbumin is written right here. It's called transthyretin. It is a transport protein that carries thyroid hormone as well as, you would guess by the retinol, which is obviously a form of vitamin A. So during inflammation, interleukin 6 is probably or arguably one of the chief inflammatory cytokines that reduces hepatic production of prealbumin. In the hospitals, we used to look at that all the time as a marker of malnutrition and inflammation, but we can also look at it in its role with vitamin A metabolism. So when that hormone, when that, not a hormone necessarily, but when that cytokine gets released, production of this protein goes down, and that disconnects from retinol binding protein. So typically, prealbumin or transthyretin is connected with retinol binding protein, which is itself connected with vitamin A. So you've got three things connected here together: prealbumin, retinol binding protein, and vitamin A. In cases of acute inflammation, this prealbumin is no longer going to be produced in sufficient quantities, and that leads to a dissociation of these two proteins from each other. Now this protein is free, and the kidneys are going to lose this protein. They want to grab onto this big three-part protein complex with the vitamin, and now when it's broken, when this chain is broken, so to speak, because of reduced production of prealbumin, now this is free to be lost in the urine, and it's going to take our precious vitamin A with it, and people become depleted in vitamin A when that happens. And that's what I've represented here. So people enter into a crisis, they get sick, they start to lose vitamin A at the time they need it. When they lose vitamin A, they become immune suppressed. They're not able to regenerate their epithelial surfaces in their lungs and in their gastrointestinal tract. And the medical doctors, we would expect, would kind of look at them and say, wow, you're really sick and you're getting worse. Well, of course they're sick and they're getting worse because now they're nutrient depleted and they're immune suppressed. But when people don't have training in nutrition, then they don't understand these things at any level. I'm explaining some things here that I've just recently written down, but the concept is people become nutritionally depleted when they are sick or stressed. And knowing that, we could have known that 30 years ago. We did know that 30 years ago. So we could have acted on this concept 30 years ago, or at least since then, with or without all of the details that I'm sharing with you right now. So I do think this was available, and we collectively as a global whatever we are, we're not really a group, a tribe, or a family, a community, I guess. We should have known that this was an eventuality. So obviously this diagram represents only one dimension of this problem. Here I've limited it to vitamin A with a little bit of conversation about protein. So when people become protein deficient, the same thing happens. So protein deficiency causes vitamin A loss. So a person could have, well, theoretically, they could have an adequate diet of vitamin A, but if they're deficient in protein, they're going to lose that vitamin A. Or if they develop liver disease or cirrhosis or alcoholism or hemochromatosis or whatever. Other pathological nutritional events are occurring at the same time, including depletion of cysteine, vitamin D, selenium, zinc, and glutathione. So This diagram alone is sufficient for us to take action on. We know that we can give vitamin A, we know it's safe, we know how to use it, we know how to dose it, we know people need it because they're losing vitamin A when they're sick. That causes dysfunction and increased vulnerability in their gastrointestinal tract and in their lungs. And this is allowed to perpetuate because of the ignorance within the medical profession of really anything related to nutrition. So, nutrition from a medical perspective is at least as follows. Of course, it's not taught, and I went to medical school and I've taken the board exams, and nutrition did not exist in either of those circumstances. But let's say this: a lot of people, especially if they don't understand, if they don't understand, excuse me, medicine. For people who don't understand the medical paradigm, and or if they don't understand nutrition, I think that they get confused when they think of medical education and nutrition. Nutrition is not simply an intervention. Nutrition is a concept. So in this case, I'm talking about vitamin A as a treatment, but I'm also talking about vitamin A as a concept. The concept is not to use it when it's needed, but to provide it because it's always needed. And to understand that what we're trying to do here isn't kill viruses, and it's not to reduce inflammation. What we're trying to do is support normal immune function. Normal immune function has two components: defense and tolerance. When people don't have vitamin A, they don't have defense and they don't have tolerance. So that's what I demonstrate on the next page. You'll see a modified version of this diagram. So crisis-induced depletion of vitamin A and induction of immune suppression. I think that's still accurate. I might change the wording of that before the day's over. So I think now we can get to a closer appreciation of what's happening in these patients with coronavirus, because they do go on to develop acute respiratory distress syndrome and acute lung injury. So how do we explain acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is, everybody knows pretty much, it's really bad lung inflammation, and acute lung injury? How do we explain more inflammation if these patients, by my own language here, if they're immune suppressed? How could they have more inflammation? So they become sick, they start to lose vitamin A. That leads to epithelial failure in the respiratory tract, loss of specialized cells, loss of epithelial cells, inability to clear mucus pathogens and debris, exacerbation of lung inflammation. Some of these patients also have they also have a gastrointestinal component. And again, nutritional ignorance and nutritional neglect. Well, here's the other side of that. When people are depleted in vitamin A, they also lose the ability to successfully or adequately generate T regulatory cells. So at the moment, they are vitamin A deficient and therefore immune suppressed. They don't have defenses. They also don't have tolerance. So their immune system isn't doing the job to clear the infection. And paradoxically, we might say at the same time, they have too much inflammation. So their defenses are low and they've got an excess of inflammation. And I think we can tie that back. In this conversation, I'm just tying it back to vitamin A, but the same thing, everything I just said also applies to vitamin D. It also applies to cysteine. We use that in the form of N-acetylcysteine or N-acetylcysteine. And it applies to selenium and zinc. So this is what we are seeing with these patients. They are borderline nutritionally deficient from the start because all of them are consuming a typical diet, and the typical diet creates marginal deficiency. Then when they get stressed, they're depleted of vitamin A, vitamin D, selenium, zinc, and cysteine. That leads to reduced immune defense and increased inflammation at the exact same moment. And I've, again, diagrammed that here, specific to vitamin A, but I think this is what's happening with these patients, and that's why they need a good antiviral nutrition protocol. And obviously I've been writing on that for 11 years, published the book on it in 2014, and I'm now in the process, since last year, before all of this started, in the process of updating that information, and this is part of that update. So thank you very much, and I'm sure you'll let me know if you have any more questions.